It is the last day of the Buddha's life. A blacksmith named Chunda has prepared a meal. The Buddha eats. Then he does something the texts record with unusual specificity. He instructs Chunda to bury whatever remains. Do not serve it to the other monks. Soon after, he is in severe pain. The Mahaparinibbana Sutta describes what follows in clinical detail. Bloody dysentery, exhaustion, a slow dying that carries him toward his final passing at Kusinara. Chunda, the text makes clear, bears no blame. The Buddha absolves him directly, calling this meal one of the two most meritorious offerings he ever received. A man whose food may have killed him, meritorious, because of the intention behind the giving, not what was in the bowl. The Pali word for the dish, Sukara Madhava, has never been definitively translated. Scholars have argued about it for over a century. It may have been pork. It may have been a kind of mushroom or truffle associated with pigs. It may have been a medicinal preparation of some kind. The word refuses to settle. We don't know what the Buddha ate that day. But the argument this meal came to symbolize about what Buddhists should eat, about what Buddhism demands of the people who follow it, that argument has never stopped. Here is the problem with the question, can Buddhists eat meat? Ask a Theravada monk in Thailand. Ask a Chinese Chan practitioner in Shanghai. Ask a Tibetan Lama in Dharamsala. You will receive 3 different answers. And each person will have solid scriptural grounds for their position. 1 bowl, 3 Buddhisms, 3 completely different conclusions about what the same teacher required. And if you eat meat, this video will not give you an easy permission slip. If you avoid meat, it will not give you an easy crown. Buddhism is rarely kind to the stories we tell about ourselves. If you've watched the 3 Schools of Buddhism video on this channel, you already have the framework for what follows. But this question cuts deeper than school affiliation. Each tradition's answer reveals what that school believes Buddhism is actually for. Is it about ending attachment, liberating all beings without exception, transforming whatever arises in experience? Each school answers through the bowl, and the answers do not agree. This video will follow each tradition's reasoning to its conclusion, not to declare a winner, but because the reasoning itself is where Buddhism reveals what it actually believes about suffering, compassion, and what the path demands. The Buddha established the Vinaya, the monastic code governing the lives of monks and nuns, and within it a precise framework for food. Not a vague ethical preference, a specific, documented rule. It is called the rule of the 3 pure kinds of flesh. Meat may be consumed by a monk under 3 conditions. He did not see the animal killed. He did not hear the animal being killed for him. He had no reason to suspect the animal was killed specifically to feed him. In the early texts, this is the rule the Buddha explains and defends. The Javaka Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 55, records the moment it was tested directly. A physician named Javaka brought an accusation to the Buddha. People were saying that animals were being killed for him and his monks. The Buddha rejected that charge and clarified the rule. The text records him saying, "I say that there are 3 cases in which meat may be eaten, when it is not seen, not heard, and not suspected." This was not a loophole, it was the foundational position, and the reasoning behind it reaches to the center of the entire monastic project. The Pali word bhikkhu, the word for Buddhist monk, means literally beggar. This was not metaphor. Picture a monk at dawn, barefoot, bowl in hand, moving through a village. A family opens their door and places food inside. He does not treat the bowl as a menu. He receives. That was the practice, not as passivity, but as discipline. The alms system created a reciprocal bond, food, clothing, and shelter from the lay community in exchange for teaching and presence. That bond required the monk to receive without discrimination. In that alms context, refusal could become preference. And preference was exactly what the Vinaya was training the monk to see and release. The Vinaya also specifies 10 categories of forbidden meat: human, elephant, horse, dog, snake, and several large predators. Everything outside that list fell within the rule. Now, this matters for everyone watching who is not a monk. The Vinaya is monastic law. The ethical framework for lay Buddhists operates on different terms. The 5 precepts, the foundational ethical code for lay practitioners, explicitly forbid killing. They do not explicitly forbid eating meat. Early Buddhist ethics treated eating and killing as related but not identical. The Anguttara Nikaya lists the trade in flesh, mamsa vanija, among the 5 forms of wrong livelihood a lay follower should avoid. The clearest karmic weight sits with the trade in killing. Eating is a separate question in the early ethical framework. So if you are watching this with a meal in mind, the steak from last night, the chicken in your fridge, the fish sauce in your noodles, early Buddhism would not begin by asking, "Is this forbidden?" It would begin by asking, "What intention brought this here?" Theravada still stands here today. Monks in Thailand, Sri Lanka, Myanmar accept whatever enters the alms bowl. Some practitioners in the Thai forest tradition have spoken openly about eating food they found personally difficult because receiving without preference, without revulsion, without craving in either direction. That is the practice. The discomfort is the teaching. It is worth noting that many contemporary Theravada teachers, including those in Ajahn Chah's lineage, have encouraged lay practitioners to reduce meat consumption as a personal expression of compassion, even while not requiring it. The permissive rule does not mean indifference to harm. It means the discipline lives in the practitioner's own honest engagement. But here is what most histories of this debate omit. The Buddha did not maintain this position quietly. He defended it against a direct internal challenge from his own cousin. Devadatta was a senior monk with real standing in the Sangha. He proposed 5 demanding reforms that would have reshaped monastic life entirely: permanent forest dwelling, eating only alms food, wearing only discarded robes, sleeping under trees, abstaining entirely from fish and meat. His argument had genuine moral force. A community dedicated to non-harming should not participate in a system that produced animal deaths at all. Those who wished to follow such austerities could do so. The Buddha refused to make them binding for everyone. He did not promote meat eating. He defended the permissive alms rule, the mendicant system, and the karmic logic of intention behind it, even as the pressure to change came from within his own family. The disagreement became one of several flashpoints that led Devadatta to attempt one of the earliest recorded splits in the Sangha. The Buddhist Council's video on this channel covers how that rupture developed. The Buddha held the rule even as Devadatta tried to fracture the community around stricter discipline. That was a position held under pressure, and it did not move. The Laṅkāvatāra Sūtra, likely composed somewhere in the 4th or 5th century CE, devotes an entire chapter to meat eating. Not a passage, a chapter, and it does not hedge. The argument runs like this. Every sentient being in this cycle of existence has, across countless lifetimes, been in close relation to you. In samsara, no embodied being has failed to be your kin, mother, father, sibling, child. To eat the flesh of any creature is to eat someone who once carried you or whom you once carried. The text makes no exceptions. The Mahaparinirvana Sutra, the Mahayana version, a completely separate text from the Pali Mahaparinibbana Sutta, makes a parallel argument. Both reach the same conclusion: a bodhisattva does not eat meat. To understand why this felt necessary, you need to understand what the bodhisattva ideal actually demands. The bodhisattva is not working toward personal liberation. The bodhisattva has taken a vow to remain in this cycle of existence until every sentient being, without exception, is free. That vow restructures every ethical question. You cannot hold it and simultaneously participate in a system that kills the beings you are trying to liberate. Within the Mahayana framework, this is a deepening of the original teaching, the widened circle of compassion demanding a widened circle of responsibility. This is also where a critique that arrived much later found its ancient roots. Not long ago, a young man from Bhutan put a question to the Dalai Lama that Muslim critics had put to him. If there is no buyer, there is no killer. Buddhists eat meat. Therefore, Buddhists sustain the killing. The Dalai Lama paused when he heard it. Then he acknowledged it had weight. The Laṅkāvatāra Sutra made that argument 1,500 years earlier. Here is where the paths start to separate. Both positions, the Vinaya's permissive alms rule and the Laṅkāvatāra's prohibition, are attributed to the same teacher. Both claim his authority. Both have been carried by millions of Buddhists across centuries of practice. The Laṅkāvatāra knows the earlier teaching exists. It answers it by treating it as provisional. This is the Mahayana doctrine of upaya, skillful means, a teaching adapted to the listener's capacity at each moment. The idea is that the Buddha adjusted his teaching to meet the readiness of his audience. Some teachings were stepping stones, not destinations. The threefold purity rule was suited to a community still learning the path. The Bodhisattva's full responsibility was the deeper teaching, held back until the tradition was ready. For Mahayana, this is not contradiction, it is completion. The earlier rule is not wrong, it is unfinished. The Theravada response is direct. The Laṅkāvatāra was composed centuries after the Buddha's death. Skillful means cannot be invoked to authorize texts that did not exist in his lifetime. Neither side has a method to resolve this that the other accepts. Two major branches of the same tradition, both holding texts, both carrying centuries of practice, both pointing to the same teacher, arriving at opposite conclusions about something he said. Each tradition took the question seriously enough to follow it all the way through. There is one more thread connecting this chapter to the next. Chan tradition later associated Bodhidharma, the figure credited with bringing Chan Buddhism to China, with the Laṅkāvatāra Sutra. The text that argued most forcefully against meat-eating arrived in China, bound to the man who helped shape Chinese Buddhism itself. What followed was not simply a doctrinal shift. It became a matter of empire. So far, two things have emerged. First, the earliest monastic rule permitted meat under strict conditions, rooted in the alms system and the karmic weight of intention. Second, Mahayana challenged that rule in the name of universal compassion and the Bodhisattva's widened responsibility. But ideas do not spread through scripture alone. They spread through kitchens, borders, monasteries, and the decisions of rulers who had the power to turn preference into policy. And this is where China changes the story entirely. Most Westerners assume Buddhism and vegetarianism naturally belong together. They are not wrong about modern Chinese Buddhism, but the reason is not purely doctrinal, it is partly imperial. In the early 6th century CE, Emperor Wu of Liang governed a large portion of China. He was a devout Mahayana Buddhist, not nominally, but with the intensity of someone who had staked his entire identity on the tradition. He sponsored monasteries and supported Buddhist scholarship. He reportedly wept during recitations of Buddhist scripture. At one point, he offered himself to a temple as a servant, and his own court had to ransom him back to the throne. He also held power over the monasteries in his domain, and he used it. Before his intervention, Chinese monastics were not categorically prohibited from fish or meat. The Mahayana arguments circulated. The Laṅkāvatāra Sūtra was read and studied, but practice varied. Emperor Wu turned ethical preference into institutional requirement, less through debate than through decree. Over centuries, what began as one ruler's enforcement became invisible. It stopped being Emperor Wu's policy and became simply what Buddhism was. Chinese Chan inherited this framework. Japanese Zen inherited much of its monastic imagination from China, though Japanese Buddhist practice later moved in more complicated directions, particularly after the Meiji-era reforms of the 19th century, which reshaped clerical life significantly. A large part of the Buddhism that shaped Western imagination arrived through these East Asian traditions, through Zen, through Chinese-influenced monastic culture, through the writers and teachers who carried those lineages west in the 20th century. One regional policy, repeated for centuries, became the image of Buddhism itself. One of the most consequential turns in Buddhist dietary history was not delivered by the Buddha or by any great Dharma master. It was institutionalized by a medieval Chinese emperor whose name most Buddhists today have never heard. After enough centuries, people stopped seeing the origin. The policy became the teaching. A vegetarian ideal that emerged on the Gangetic Plain eventually reached the Himalayas. The Tibetan Plateau sits at over 4,000 meters above sea level. The growing season is short, the terrain is severe, the land itself had a vote. Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana, largely maintained meat consumption historically, and this was not ignorance of the Mahayana texts. Tibetan monks studied the Laṅkāvatāra Sutra. They engaged Mahayana philosophy with extraordinary precision. The geographical reality simply could not be argued away. The doctrinal argument, though, runs deeper than geography. Vajrayana operates on a principle of transformation rather than avoidance. Where Theravada trains the practitioner to release attachment, and Mahayana asks the bodhisattva to redirect it toward all beings, Vajrayana works directly with experience. The practitioner does not refuse what arises. The practitioner learns to meet it, consecrate it, and change their relationship to it. In Vajrayana's understanding of enlightenment, the path does not bypass the contents of ordinary life. It runs straight through them. Within some Vajrayana contexts, this extends to ritual practice. The sock offering, a ritual feast within certain tantric lineages, can include meat. This belongs to a specific ritual structure of transformation, not a relaxation of the ideal. Many Tibetan lamas have eaten meat historically, and some still do. The Dalai Lama, whom much of the Western world associates most closely with Buddhist compassion toward all living beings, has spoken about his own situation without evasion. He has said that he committed to vegetarianism, but after developing serious health problems, doctors from both the Tibetan and allopathic traditions advised him to resume eating some meat. In one interview, he described his body turning entirely yellow from the illness, and noted with his characteristic directness that he had at least achieved the color of a living Buddha, if not through the method he would have chosen. He tells this story himself. He does not minimize the tension in it. The figure many Westerners most associate with compassion for all sentient beings has at times eaten meat on medical advice. When these interviews circulate, the reaction is reliably unsettled, sometimes a sense of betrayal from people who had never questioned the assumption. What that reaction reflects is Emperor Wu's legacy, still moving through Western Buddhist imagination centuries after his death. One regional policy, repeated long enough, became the measure against which every Buddhist tradition was judged. When the Tibetan tradition doesn't match that measure, it reads as failure rather than difference. The Tibetan story, though, does not hold still. As the Dalai Lama himself has noted publicly, many major Tibetan monastic institutions in India now serve vegetarian food in their common kitchens. As the geography changed, the practice followed. The Plateau made the argument for centuries, then the tradition moved, and the answer began to shift. Every Buddhist argument about meat eventually arrives at the same word: Ahimsa, non-harming. And this is where most contemporary discussions of Buddhism and diet misread the tradition, because the question of harm in Buddhist ethics leads somewhere unexpected. Buddhism does not frame ethics primarily as transgression against divine law. It frames ethics through intention, action, and consequence. Once you see that, the whole meat debate shifts. The Pali term is kama, rendered in Sanskrit as karma, and kama operates through intention. The same act, performed with different intentions, generates different karmic consequences. Intention is the operative principle, not the act in isolation. This is why the threefold purity rule holds together within Theravada's ethical architecture. A monk who accepts meat he did not request, did not hear being killed, had no reason to suspect was killed for him. That monk does not carry the same direct karmic burden as the person who killed the animal, ordered the killing, or requested it. Different intentions, different consequences. For Theravada lay practitioners, this same logic applies. Vegetarianism, chosen as a personal expression of compassion, is entirely acceptable, even admirable. The tradition simply does not require it. The ethical line is drawn at killing and commissioning killing, not at eating. Mahayana extends the karmic account further. Your demand participates in a system. Even without direct intention, your choices sustain what produces the killing. The bodhisattva cannot afford the narrower calculation. Vajrayana places the weight on awareness itself. Eating mindlessly and eating with intentional dedication, offering the meal, transforming the act through conscious practice, are karmically different acts even when the food on the plate is identical. Ahimsa predates Buddhism. Jainism followed non-harming further than Buddhism chose to go. Many Jain practices restrict eating after dark, partly to avoid harming unseen small beings. Pulling a root vegetable kills the plant. The principle was extended as far as the tradition could carry it. Buddhism drew a different line. The reason reveals what the tradition was actually targeting. The Buddha's concern was not harm reduction as a terminal goal. It was craving, the force that generates harm, that drives suffering, that sustains the cycle the path exists to interrupt. A practice built obsessively around harm avoidance while driven by anxiety or the need to be seen as spiritually serious is still craving. It has found a more sophisticated object. This is also where Buddhist Ahimsa and contemporary secular veganism share vocabulary while operating from different foundations. Modern ethical veganism is built on frameworks of rights, harm reduction, and systemic accountability, powerful arguments on their own terms. Buddhist ethics center on the question of what is driving the mind. The two can arrive at the same dietary choice. They are not the same project. Most of us do not eat from philosophy. We eat from habit, convenience, culture, pleasure, memory. Then later, We build a philosophy around what we already wanted. Most people encounter this question nowhere near a monastery. They encounter it at dinner, with family, with someone across the table who is watching what they ordered, a plate in front of them, and a choice that suddenly feels like a statement about who they are. If there is meat on your plate, Buddhism does not ask you to perform guilt. It asks you to look clearly. Was there craving? Was there indifference? Was there gratitude? Was there compassion trying to grow, but not yet strong enough to change the habit? The Buddha once encountered a king named Pasenadi, a layman who appears across multiple conversations in the suttas, always with the concerns of an ordinary human life. The texts describe him eating enormous portions regularly until his health began to suffer. The Buddha's response was not a dietary rule, it was a verse. When a person is constantly mindful and knows when enough food has been taken, all their afflictions become more slender. They age more gently. They protect their lives. Pasenadi took this seriously enough to hire a young man to repeat that verse at every single meal, so it would never leave his awareness while he ate. Over time, he recovered. When the Buddha saw him again, the texts record that he was pleased. The bowl mattered. The mind holding it mattered more. A vegetarian diet can be a genuine act of compassion. It can also become an identity, a source of pride, a way of measuring oneself against others. Eating meat can be careless and indifferent to what it sustains. It can also be received without craving, without preference, without ego. For a lay Buddhist today, honest engagement with that question may lead to vegetarianism. It may lead to eating less meat, avoiding industries built on cruelty, or simply becoming more truthful about what desire is actually doing at the table. Buddhism keeps returning to the question beneath the food. What is happening in the mind that is eating? There is no single Buddhist answer to the question this video opened with, and the absence of a single answer is in many ways the most Buddhist thing about it. Theravada looked into the bowl and saw attachment. The discipline lives in how you receive, not in what was received. Even refusal can become attachment. The practice lives in the quality of reception. Mahayāna looked into the bowl and saw suffering. The suffering of every being that might have filled it, every being who had once been kin. The Bodhisattva's vow extends that far. Every choice implicates you in something larger than your own liberation. Vajrayana looked into the bowl and saw transformation. What you consume is not the only question. What you bring to the act, the awareness, the intention, the dedication, that is the practice. Consciousness is what transforms it. Devadatta wanted a rule. An emperor issued a decree. A plateau provided a constraint. The Dalai Lama told his doctor's story publicly and let the world sit with what it made of it. Each tradition found something different at the bottom of the bowl because each was asking a different question about liberation. What human beings are, what they owe each other, how far the circle of responsibility extends. The Buddha did not leave a diet, he left a path. What you eat along that path matters, but perhaps not as much as whether you can look honestly at the mind that is eating. Chunda the blacksmith never knew what he had served. The word refuses to settle, and the Buddha, dying, called it meritorious anyway. Before you comment with what Buddhists should do, try answering for yourself first. When you eat, which question is most honest for you? Are you attached? Are you compassionate? Or are you trying to transform what you touch? Leave that answer in the comments. That is the conversation worth having. If you want to go deeper into how the Buddhist schools developed and where they separated, The Buddhist Council's video is on screen now. And if this is your first time on the channel, subscribe and turn on notifications. Until the next one.